So we're making a shift from East Asian major religions, right? In Southeast Asian, you think of Hinduism and Buddhism. And we're coming, in a sense, back what is probably home to most of us in the West with the three major monotheistic religions. And for the first week or so, the readings and the discussion are going to be dealing with the underlying realities, underlying narratives for Judaism, Christianity, and in some ways even Islam. All three of these faiths are based on a core creative monotheistic God and his calling of a man, Abraham, and really the question of what it means to be a descendant of Abraham and faithful to that calling. So these are going to be two core concepts for anything we have to say about Judaism specifically, Christianity, or Islam. And we'll get into some of the elements of modern Judaism and the developments of Christianity and how Christianity and Judaism kind of split off of each other. But all three of these big monotheistic religions are called Abrahamic traditions. And so the stories that you should have read, hopefully, you've read the first part of Genesis. And if you haven't, you need to do that really before the lecture. It'll make more sense if you read first and then watch this lecture, because we'll be drawing on that reading, that Genesis 1 through 25. And that story is what underlies all of the rest of what we're going to discuss. Now, this is a big shift, because if you think about what we've discussed, kind of one of the core things between Hinduism, Buddhism, is this idea of samsara, cycles of life, death, rebirth, life, death, rebirth. And that cycle, you can see in the middle of this picture, that kind of infinity symbol. That's to make the point that it's a cycle, but it's a cycle that goes on forever. There is a sense, obviously, that everything eventually comes together as the kind of one ultimate monistic reality, not monotheistic. Everything, the whole universe is God. God is the whole universe. It's just broken up into parts, and it'll eventually come back together. But the thing is, the mythology, especially of Hinduism, is that that cycle goes on forever. The Hindu will say, well, it doesn't matter that there are different creation stories because there have been different creations, different universes. And so these stories, they're different ages in a sense. So everything breaks up, there's a new creation and new things, and then it all comes back together into the one, and then you find again the sea of chaos. Everything has melded into this sea, and then you find, Krishna sitting on the sea, and then he creates, and Vishnu, is this creator god. Shiva, the destroyer and recreator, because it all starts over and over again. And it's this kind of eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth, not only of individuals, because you lose your individuality, but of the whole universe. That's really foreign to most of us in the West. And it's not just some idea about individuals. It's the whole universe. The whole process starts again and again and again and keeps going. Not so with the religions we're about to discuss, the monotheistic religions. Right? They're based on creation and a timeline, and we'll get into that in a minute. But before we do, I want you to think just briefly about something. And that's a lot of times when I have students read these stories, it's because I'm familiar with the Jewish rabbinic tradition, because I'm very familiar as a Christian with the Christian understanding. It always shocks me, but I find this more and more, that students read these first chapters of Genesis, and I ask them, what do you think about, these stories, this God, and all this? And inevitably, someone will say, harsh, strict, mean. And I've tried to really think through, why is this? Because this is not at the heart of Judaism. It's not at the heart of Christianity. That's not the image, the vision, perspective that you get on God from these traditions that draw on these readings. And I think some of it is a language issue, but I think some of it is our narrative, the narrative we inhabit. And we've talked about that, right? That's why I spent so much time on that, is because to really appreciate these religious traditions, to appreciate where people are coming from and what they're saying, you're going to have a real disconnect if you try to read these scriptures from your own narrative perspective. Because our narrative is rooted in this idea of no limits. And I get that phrase from another university where I teach. That's kind of their slogan. You can do anything with the education you get here. There's no limits. That's kind of the message of our society, right? Follow your heart, believe in yourself, to quote Rex from Toy Story movies, right? Sorry, I have kids, but it's kind of that Disney message, right? Believe in yourself. You can do anything if you only believe. There's no limits to what you can become. But that's just not reality. We can feel that way because of what we carry a computer in our pocket that can pull up just about any piece of information known to humankind in seconds or minutes. I mean, that's insane when you think about it. But I mean, understand, I'm old enough to remember when, if you wanted to get on the internet, you had to have a computer plugged into a phone line, and it took 20 minutes to download any kind of page with a picture. Every web page had text-only versions of the web page for when you were doing research, because people would design these wonderful research web pages with all these nice pictures, but you'd sit there for 20 minutes between pages. You wanted to read the information, so you would you'd have to pick a text only, and then there was a limit to what was on the internet. Things were just being put up, and if you wanted to do research, you had to go to the library, quite honestly, and actually find books. Amazingly. That was, I was in college 20 years ago, and we still did that, So there are reasons that we have this idea that life is unlimited, that we can do whatever we want, we can accomplish, we can be whatever we want. But it's not realistic if you think about it. I mean, there are limits, right? Just to be practical, if I go to the top of a 10-story building, I can't just fly off of it. I'm limited. I'm a human being. If I step off the edge, I'm going to die. All of our lives have limits. We have things that we simply cannot do. We have things that we're good at and things that we're not good at. There's a reason that we all don't get paid millions of dollars to play for the NFL or the NBA or the WNBA. It's not just a matter of discipline and training. Those things play into it. I was never going to be an NBA player. I once tutored a football player, a college football player. There was no way I was ever going to play college football because he was huge. I would never be that size. And he was getting sent home to train more to get bigger. There are limits to our existence, right? There are things that you're capable of, you're very capable of. There are some things that you're just not capable of. But we're not conditioned mentally to think that way. We're told again and again, you should have what you want, you can do what you want, you can accomplish what you want. These stories that you're reading are in a world where you can't run to a grocery store, right? Your food doesn't come wrapped in plastic. You can't turn on a faucet and have clean water. Anybody ever try to build a fire in a fireplace or in a fire pit outside on a nice cool evening? Some people don't even know how to do that, but we have matches. A lot of people think building a fire is buying a fire starter from the grocery store, throwing some sticks and a couple of logs on top of it, lighting a match, lighting the paper on the fire starter, and suddenly you have this nice fire. If you've ever done any rustic camping, it doesn't work that way. And even in camping, if you're a camper, you probably have matches. I don't know if you've ever tried to start a fire without a match. It's not an easy thing. And it's not just a matter of a pleasant afternoon or pleasant evening, on a cool evening, having a fire in the fire pit. This is life. It's warmth, it's light, it's the way you cook your food. And as for your food, how do you get that food? There's no store. There's no drive-up window where you can just pick up a hamburger because you're a little bit hungry. Like I said, there's no faucet. There's no light switch. There's no just, I'm going to pick up a bottle of water or turn on the bathroom faucet and have clean water with which I can brush my teeth. You have to dig wells. And much of these stories take place in a region of the world that's somewhat arid. And we won't go into all of the underlying realities, but there are a couple of empires surrounding the lands of the Bible. Babylon and Assyria, the Sumerians to one side, to their kind of east, and to their to their kind of southwest is Egypt. The reason those regions become empires is because they have these massive rivers that stabilize life. But everywhere else, life is dependent on seasonal rains, seasonal snows, and a bad year could mean death for family members, not, having to depend upon government agencies for safety net. Those didn't exist. You were on your own. Why did all these women in these stories need children? Because it's a dangerous world. And typically, men were physically stronger than women. And so women typically lived in a place where they needed the protection of men. And if they didn't have a husband, they needed a son or a good brother to make sure they were protected from marauders and raids. These are the realities of the world in which these stories are told in the Old Testament. So it's odd to me when you think about that, when you really put yourself in those contexts, right? We say, oh, God's harsh, he's strict. What? He puts them in this garden and then he says, if you eat this fruit, you're going to die. And we think, wow, that's so restrictive. Think about that, though. So restrictive. God makes a perfect garden, puts people in it, made in his image, meets with them every day. There's this intimacy, there's this fellowship. And he says, you can have it all except one thing. And our mind, our modern mind, our postmodern mind thinks, oh, that's a limiting, mean, harsh God, right? Well, no. I mean, from the Jewish perspective, from the Christian perspective, this is a generous God. And it shows the weakness of humanity, right? God gives you everything and only gives you one limit. But you determine to have the one thing instead of all this generosity. Every other fruit, the tree of life itself. But you must have the one thing that you can't have. And so that's the mentality of the scriptures and the people who told these stories and preserved these stories. You'll read in some places in the Old Testament that God is a jealous God, and we somehow think of that as envious. This word is not envious. Okay, we have to remember that these texts were written in other languages and have been translated. That jealous means zealous, passionate. God's love for his people is passionate, often compared to the love of a husband for a wife. What man, what woman, right, is not going to be horribly offended, deeply wounded if the person that they love so entirely and give their whole self to cheats on them, right? But that's how these scriptures relate the idea of idolatry, the worship of other gods, the failure to obey those laws that God sets. And those laws themselves, even the more kind of mundane ones that people hate to read, they're based on ordering and giving a stable society in a very difficult world. So when you read these stories, remember to get past your idea, your kind of cultural programming for no limits. That's not the way life works, even now, even though sometimes it feels like it. But it's certainly not the way anyone in the ancient world of these scriptures understood things. There were clearly limits to every part of life. So the key question for these scriptures is, what does it mean to be the people of God? That's what the text is asking us, and that's what the text is seeking to answer. And we'll get into what I mean by that. But if you remember, okay, think about the first reading from Lewontin. He quotes Carl Sagan, who's talking about why he doesn't believe in the scriptures, why he thinks the kind of, especially the Christian faith, is rather doubtful. He says, the fact that so little of the findings of modern science is prefigured in Scripture, to my mind, casts further doubt on its divine inspiration. Now, I'm not trying to argue for or against divine inspiration, but I want you to see the way we think, the way we read. And if you want to understand Judaism, Christianity, Islam, if you really care to kind of embrace that intellectual hospitality that I talked about early on in the semester, and listen to people as they're speaking and not your idea of what they're saying, then you need to grasp that we often read the scriptures just like what I was just talking about with the no limits. We often read asking even the wrong questions. We're trying to fit our questions onto their answers. And what Carl Sagan wants to know is, physically speaking, in terms of astrophysics and atomic physics and biology, how did the world begin? That's his question. And so he looks at the Bible and he says, oh, this can't be true because it really doesn't line up with what we already know. But there's a problem with reading it that way, because the people who wrote down these scriptures and the people who read these scriptures and live according to these scriptures and preserve these scriptures for ages and ages were not asking that question. It wasn't written about physically, biologically, astrophysics, atomic physics. That wasn't the point. That wasn't the question they were asking. They were asking a very different question. Okay, so we've got to not supply our modern questions to their ancient answers when we read a creation story or when we read about a law and we think, oh, that law is so horrible and harsh and mean. That sounds so mean. Why is God mean like that? Or when we read, something about worship and the way worship happens. They're asking entirely different questions, and so they're answering those questions, and usually quite well, which is the reason these scriptures have been, part of the reason these scriptures have been preserved for ages. Is because when you understand the questions they want to ask, and you understand the answers fit, and you understand how those answers fit those questions, and what they're saying about the world, and what they're saying about individuals, what they're saying about the value of life and human life and interaction and community, and what they're saying about God, then it's very different than trying to read Genesis 1 creation story and match it up with modern astrophysics. That's why we often don't understand it, and it creates a lot of debates from both sides, believers and non-believers alike. There are famous atheists who became atheists by reading the Bible. I would contend they did that because they were reading the Bible with modern questions that they were trying to stick on top of ancient answers. So I want to encourage you not to do that. Right? And here's an example. So the creation story, which you should have read, right? Genesis 1. And we'll talk about some differences between Genesis 1 and 2 in a bit. But Genesis 1 is written, and it's written from a perspective of a world that's very religious, and the religion is expressed in a very temple, cultic, ordered society. And that understanding of the world is that God is there, and you recognize God, you build him a temple, and you place the image of God in the temple. Now, for most of the societies surrounding the Jews, these cultures were polytheistic, often sort of totemistic almost, or a little bit after that. They're gods. The gods are part of nature, connected to nature. Think about the Hindu gods, right? The gods are part of this world. And in these ancient polytheistic lands surrounding the Jews, they're polytheistic. So Baal is the kind of god of prosperity and of productivity. He's a nature god. He provides rains when you make the proper sacrifices. Ashtaroth is his consort, his wife. He's kind of a sex god, sexual productivity, proliferation, having children, producing of the cattle. These gods, if you look at Egypt, we'll look at the Exodus from Egypt, but all the gods correlate to various parts of nature: the river, the sun, the land itself. The heaven is a god, the earth is a god or a goddess, and the heavens and the earth come together in this sexual union, and that creates everything else. This is the way that many of the cultures surrounding the Jews believed. And so Genesis 1 is written in that cultural context, but it's written countering those ideas. It's dealing with those religious questions. In Genesis 1, you have a universe that's created by God. God is outside the universe. He's not part of it. He's not an element of it. He's not the heavens and the earth. And in fact, this is part of the point in the structure of creation. We have the heavens above, or the waters above, and the waters beneath, the firmament. These things are separated, and the earth is separated out of the waters beneath. So you have these three realms of creation: the heavens above, the waters beneath, and the earth in the middle. And this is the sum total of the universe as understood by all peoples, regardless of which pagan religion they followed, or in fact, if they were Jewish. Or really, the Jewish name doesn't quite work this far back. But these Hebrew first monotheists, they saw the world that way. Just like in the modern world, any Muslim, any Hindu, any Christian, any Taoist, any Jehovah's Witness, anybody of a religious faith, pretty much in the modern world, understands that the earth goes around the sun. We live in a solar system that's part of a galaxy, that's part of a much vaster universe. Most modern religious believers understand all that, and it has no bearing on their religious understanding or their lack of religious understanding. It's the structure of the world as understood. And you know what? We make scientific discoveries all the time that shape and shift the way we understand that physical, astrophysical structure. So the Bible was written to people that lived in a world that had an astrophysical construct. Heavens above, waters beneath, land between. 3 realms of existence. This is what the world looked like as they observed it. This is how they understood it. Rain falls from the sky, so there must be waters above. We see the waters around us, which are part and essence of life. Every life seems to depend upon waters, so life comes up from the waters beneath. And then the earth, which provides food, which provides stability. So here's the 3 realms of existence. And in fact, God made them all. And in fact, in the creation story, what? The sun is not a god, as he is in Egypt. The moon is not a god, as she is in Babylon. No, they're just objects made by God and set in their places to kind of govern, in a very figurative sense, light and dark, day and night. And the interesting thing about this whole temple construct, right, when an ancient temple was built to the worship of God, it was to be built by man for God. But here's another place where the Jewish story, the Hebrew story, confronts this polytheistic ancient story. It says, no, the temple is creation itself, and it was made by God for man. And in fact, in the ancient temple, pagan temple constructs, the temple construction was not complete until the idol, the image, was placed in its proper place in the temple as the image bearer of the gods that temple was constructed to glorify. Well, in Genesis 1, what do we have? We have this construction of the whole world as a temple, and the idol, or the image bearer, humanity, is set in place, and that point is when creation is seen as very good. It's connected to worship. It's connected to the understanding of these very spiritual realities that impact all of life, heavens and earth and everything in them. And when you get to the law, this is in the 10 Commandments, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in, where? Heaven above, the earth beneath, or the water that is under the earth. Here is a summation of the first creation story, the 3 realms of existence. They are things made by God. You do not carve anything incorporated in those into an image to be worshipped. Because why? Because God is something outside of those. God is someone who has made those. He personally has created those realms of existence, and he has created mankind, humanity, and stuck him into that realm of existence. That's the point of the creation story. And it's connected to the religious understanding of the world. And you have to be careful, because religion is not a separate realm for ancient peoples. And even for a lot of peoples today, all of life is a unity. But that's what we have to see, and that's what I mean by not supplying modern questions to ancient answers. The question that Genesis 1 is asking has to do with, what does it mean to be the people of God? And to answer that question, we have to answer another question. Who or what is God? And what is he like? So Sagan's kind of saying, well, I don't see anything from modern science prefigured in Scripture. Well, of course not. Why would you think you should? They weren't asking the same questions you were asking. So to understand these belief systems, you really have to ask what questions they were asking and see what the answers that they give are and how well those answers match up to the questions. This is not just my modern idea of how to deal with creation stories versus modern understanding of creation. This isn't some kind of apologetic contest with Carl Sagan. My point is we have to step beyond our social, cultural context and understanding our modern questions and get at, if we want to understand, get at what the questions were and how they understood things and what was going on. And this is a quote from St. Augustine of Hippo from 415 AD. And he's making the point that the whole issue of creation and the physical world, that he's talking about the meaning of Genesis. This is from a work called The Literal Meaning of Genesis. And he's basically noting the fact that the scientific understanding of the world, even at his time, in 415 AD, had already differed from the observable scientific ideas of the universe when the book of Genesis was written and preserved in the Hebrew culture. And St. Augustine says, look, this is any Christian that's trying to fit the creation story in Genesis in with kind of just the observations of how the physical world works is missing the point entirely. And they're actually bringing shame and trouble to Christianity because they argue things in such a way that non-believers, which Augustine is interested in having them become believers because he believes Christianity is true, right? So he's saying when you try to fit just common reasoned scientific observation into the scriptures, you try to squish these together, not paying attention to what the scriptures are asking and answering and what they're talking about, then you're going to end up looking foolish because you're saying things that anyone else knows by observation isn't true. Just as a side example of what type of thing he would be talking about, perhaps, or another one that often gets taken into account when you get into the laws, and we won't read these, but the ancient Hebrew laws, there are things that you can eat and things that you can't eat, and this has to do with holiness and separation to God and being different from the surrounding cultures and even to some degree what's healthy and what's unhealthy. And it describes these animals by, at one point, those that have the parted hoof and chew the cud. So cows are something you can eat. Goats are something you can eat. Sheep are something you can eat. Because they all have a hoof that's not solid, and they chew the cud. But if they don't meet both of those criteria, then you can't eat them. Horse, doesn't matter if they chew the cud, they don't have a parted hoof, right? A pig has a parted hoof, but it doesn't chew the cud, so you can't eat it. But one of the things it mentions is a rock badger, and it says, although it chews the cud, it does not have a parted hoof. No, rock badgers don't chew the cud. So people say, the Bible's wrong. Well, if you were an ancient person watching a rock badger, they make a chewing motion. Looks a lot like rabbits chewing cud. And so the point of the text was not a scientific observation to say what animals chew the cud. The point of the text was how do we tell what to eat and what not to eat. And from appearances, this is what it looks like. So the Bible often deals with appearances to an ancient person, how something looked, to give that person a rule of life that had to do with the whole of their existence and their religious life and connected to worship and their part of the community of faith and the part of being the people of God. These are not scientific documents meant to be exacting observations for biological purposes and studies. You have to understand what questions they're asking. And the questions of the creation stories and the questions of so many other of these stories is, what does it mean to be God's people and who is God? So we've talked about, right, how are the heavens and the earth described at the first moment of creation? So we went through that, how that structure, right, heavens above, earth beneath, land in the middle, and it's this temple. But on a more basic level, how are they described? They're described as good. And once the image, right, we talked about the temple structure, and man is put into it as the image bearer, as the idol, the representative of God in this temple of creation is humanity, man and woman, placed together. And at that point, it's called very good. And this very good has to do with completion. It is complete and ready to fulfill the purpose for which it was made, which is to connect humanity to God. And so we get Genesis 1 and 2. Both show us something about humanity. Humanity is made to be in relationship with each other and with God. God walks in the cool of the evening. There's this intimacy. They're the image bearers of God. They have innate value. By being human, you are valuable because you were created by God. And this is at the essence and the core of all the Abrahamic traditions. Your life, your bodily life matter. Right? And so God calls stuff. Matter matters. Stuff is good. Plants are good. Animals are good. Dirt is good. Stuff itself is good. Right? And in fact, when you start reading Genesis 1 through 4, death is not good. Death is not neutral. Death means that things are out of order. Now here again, we can argue how that might look scientifically, physically, biologically, but the point of Genesis 1 through 4 is for humans, death is unnatural. A lot of people trying to create these, have put these modern questions on these ancient answers again, start saying, well, for the universe to exist, even before man, there had to be death because there's life cycles, plants die, things rot, things feed. Yes, that's true. There again, I would refer you to St. Augustine, right? The point of the Genesis story is human death. Human death means something is out of order because the human is set in the created order as the image bearer and the order keeper. And in fact, by eating from the tree of life, he is supposed to never die. Because when we see in chapter 3 of Genesis, when humankind's sin, when they disobey, when they make themselves God, instead of recognizing God as God, and themselves as his image bearer, as his priest and servants and intimate friends, when they try to make themselves God, what happens? God says, we have to remove humanity from the tree of life, otherwise he'll live forever. So even in the ancient text, there's this recognition that it doesn't mean simply physical death of anything. Not like a tree doesn't die, a plant doesn't die, no animals die. This has to do with human reality. And for the human, whether we believe in these religions or not, think about this. Most of us really are uncomfortable with death. Death seems wrong. It just shouldn't happen, right? We lose a loved one, and this really sucks. It stinks. We don't like it, right? We think about our own death, and then we try not to. We try to hide from it, drown it out, cover it up with entertainment. Living life to the fullest. All these things are to try to hide from ourselves the reality of our own death, which seems so unfair in many instances. Why do we have to die? There's something in us that doesn't want to die. And so this faith tradition recognizes that, right? This monotheistic Abrahamic tradition addresses this as you feel that way because human death is unnatural. Okay? That's key. Who is God? What does it mean to be the people of God? What is human reality? Death. It's unnatural. It doesn't work for me to die, for you to die. Sure, a plant can die, but human death, this self-aware being, right? Think of Hamlet. So like a god, and yet, what is this human being? This quintessence, right? This dust, in a sense. We die and we turn to dust. Why is that? When we're so like a god, this bothers us. It eats at us. And so this is part of what this faith tradition is dealing with. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. God is concerned in this faith about the very blood and the contamination of blood on the earth, the shedding of blood, the killing of a brother, the death of a human being. This is tragic. And in fact, it's so tragic that the first punishment for the first murder is not death. In fact, God marks Cain and says nobody should kill him. Why? Because Cain's life matters too. Life is important. Human life is precious. And this is part of the underlying reality for the Abrahamic traditions. Life, human life, bodily life matters. Death of the human is the world out of order. That's not the way it should be. Now think, it's very different, right, from Hinduism, Buddhism. Not that they are for murder, that's not what I'm getting at. I'm talking about the idea, the understanding of death. And we read the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talking to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita in a Hindu context. What does he say about going to battle and killing these great men, right? Arjuna is despondent because he doesn't want to kill these great men in battle. And no culture looks at this type of killing the same as murder. They're two different things in the sense, both for Jews and for Hindus. To murder a person or to kill a person in battle are two different things. Nonetheless, think about this. The spilling of blood. In a later story, King David of the Jews, he's the Jewish example of the greatest king, a true worshiper of God, loves God. He's called the man after God's own heart. And he wants to build a temple for God. And God says, no, David, you're a man of blood. You've been a warrior your whole life. You've been at war your whole life. You've killed so many people in battle. You are a man of blood. You cannot build my temple. A man of peace has to build my temple. David's a man after God's own heart. But the fact that he shed so much blood, even though it's in just battles to defend his nation, to protect his people, he is a man of blood, and the shedding of blood is a problematic element. The shedding of human blood is a problem. But for the Hindu, what do we see? The spirit as indestructible, immortal, unborn, always the same. He can't kill or be killed. And in fact, what does it say about the body? As a man discards his threadbare robes and puts on new, so the spirit throws off its worn-out bodies and takes fresh ones. Remember, samsara, reincarnation. The body is really fairly insignificant within Hinduism. Because stuff is what? It's Maya. It's illusion. Matter doesn't really matter. All that matters is the spirit. Matter, your body, it's like an old torn up robe. Throw it away. You'll get a new one. It's not really part of you. The real you is somewhere deep down inside this tiny piece of the ultimate reality. Everything else is just to be thrown off. But that's not the Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic, Islamic understanding. The body is precious. And I turn again to St. Augustine, because he has this writing on the care of the dead. What does he say? If you look down a few sentences, probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about the 7th line near the end. For our bodies are not some ornament or aid which is added from outside. They're not some old robe to be cast off. It belongs to the very nature of man, right? And he compares it. He says, you know, we treasure the clothes of our parents when they die, or the ring of our father when he dies. How much more their body? The body, right, are not something added. They're part of us. They're part of our very being. And so within the Abrahamic tradition, there isn't this clear divide between the spiritual reality and the material Maya. The material matters. In fact, in the Talmud, this is a rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the temple. The Talmud, this commentaries on the Hebrew scriptures, right? The Hebrew Bible. There's a story, and this one rabbi is asked, you know, when it comes to judgment, the body and soul can each excuse themselves from sin by claiming that the transgression is the fault of the other, since without the one, it is lifeless. This is from a common understanding of what it means to be human, Aristotelian. Aristotle saw the soul and the body as inseparable. They can't exist. They're two different things, but they can't exist alone. But the rabbi says, no, look. 2 guards, one blind and one lame, are in a garden. Together they are able to steal some fruit from a high tree. When caught, each claims that he is obviously unable to commit the crime due to his disability. In the end, the orchard owner places the lame man on the back of the blind man, and they are judged as one. Similarly, God judges the actions of the body and soul in partnership after returning the soul to the body at resurrection. This resurrection, this is a Jewish idea that transcends, it flows through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because the body matters. Matter is good. God made it. It's not illusion. This is a key difference from these Eastern traditions that we've studied. This actually shapes the culture that we live in the West tremendously. It matters. To the religion, your body, the treatment of the body are important because the body is part of who you are. It's not some threadbare robe to be cast off. And from all these faith perspectives, there is the idea of a bodily resurrection, not an escape or a release of the soul from something foreign, but a return of the soul to a remade and perfected body, which is its true home. This is very different from these Eastern traditions, right? So that brings us to the source of these Abrahamic faiths. Abraham. Think about in your reading the promise that God makes to Abraham. There's the basic promise. I'm going to make of you a great nation. Your descendants will number as the sands of the sea, as the stars of the sky. These are very important. They're key to the development of the whole story of the Hebrew people. But the part that becomes central for modern Judaism and for Christianity, this is probably where Islam breaks off. It connects to Abraham. It connects to the promise, you'll be the father of many nations. You're a faithful worshiper of God. That's where it goes within Islam. Abraham is the founder. He's the father of Ishmael. He taught Ishmael the right worship of the one true God, and Ishmael passed that on to his family, the Hanif, and they carried on the right worship of the one true God, and Muhammad picked that up and furthered it. It's the one faith that goes back to Abraham, that goes back to Adam. That's the Muslim idea. But there's a part of the promise that's essential for Christianity and Judaism, and they're split from each other, from this ancient Hebrew scriptures. Muslims have the Quran, and it retells a lot of these stories and adds some other stories to it. But for the Christians and the Jews, these Hebrew scriptures, as we have them, are a core. And at that core is this call of Abraham, through your seed, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And so one of the big questions for Jews and Christians will become, how is that promise fulfilled by God? What's the seed? What's the blessing? How does that work? That becomes central to what it means to be the people of God for Jews and Christians. Everything we've said before now about creation, about God, about man as humans as God's image bearer, about stuff being important, about matter mattering, about the body being a reality, all that is true of Islam. But when we begin talking about this promise to Abraham, through your seed all the nations of the world will be blessed, Islam takes a very different route. Judaism and Christianity split with the coming of Jesus and what they say about Jesus and what they say about the nation of the Jews and how that relates to this promise to Abraham. So here's the promise, right? Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be blessing. See that, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Other translations in other places of this promise is through your seed, right? All the nations of the earth will be blessed. So this is central. What does that mean? In Abraham, all the nations are blessed.